My dad said no one would ever love me if I cut my hair. When I was 14, my sister Ivy's hair got caught in the chain on the swing set and started ripping her scalp off. And while she was screaming and bleeding, my dad just stood there yelling, "Why weren't you more careful with it?" Dad was completely obsessed with long hair on women. He came from this family where all the women had hair down to their ankles and they called it their crowning glory or whatever. His own mother had hair so long she had to carry it in her arms to walk. And Dad kept this massive photo of her in the living room like she was royalty. When he married Mom, her hair was down to her waist, and apparently when I was born, the first thing he said was, "I can't wait to see how long hers gets." Every single night, Dad would brush my hair for an hour while going on about how hair was a woman's true beauty, and cutting it was basically a sin. He wouldn't even let us trim split ends. Mom's hair was down past her knees, and she had constant migraines from the weight. She couldn't drive because her hair would get stuck in the seatbelt or tangled around the gear shift. One time, she tried to pull it back in a bun, and Dad screamed, "What's the point of having beautiful hair if you're going to hide it like you're ashamed?" Ivy was 12, and her hair literally dragged on the ground behind her. Mine was down to my thighs. We had to wash it every day with this $50 shampoo and spend hours detangling it while Dad watched to make sure we weren't pulling out too many strands. When I was 7, I snuck into the bathroom with Mom's sewing scissors and cut off like 6 inches. I just wanted to be able to run without stepping on my own hair. I thought if I only cut a little bit, Dad wouldn't even notice. But when he came to brush my hair that night, he saw the uneven ends and completely lost it. He didn't yell at first, which was somehow worse. He just got really quiet and said, "You've destroyed something precious that can never be replaced." Then he left and came back with this wig that went all the way down to the floor. He made me wear it every single day until my real hair grew back to the length it was before. The wig was so heavy, I got neck pain and headaches. And it was like 3 feet longer than my actual hair, so I was constantly tripping over it. Kids at school made fun of me, and I'd come home crying, but Dad would just say, "Good. Maybe now you'll understand why you should appreciate your real hair." I had to wear that thing for almost 2 years, and I never tried to cut my hair again after that. Dad built a swing set because he wanted us to play outside with our hair blowing in the wind like some shampoo commercial. Mom said it wasn't safe, but Dad insisted we needed fresh air. Ivy got on the swing and started going pretty high, and her hair was whipping everywhere. Then I heard this sound like fabric tearing, and Ivy started screaming. Her hair had wrapped completely around the chain, and when the swing came back down, it just pulled. There was blood pouring down her neck and this chunk of scalp hanging by like an inch of skin, and she was making these horrible choking sounds. Dad ran over, but instead of helping her, he just stared at all the hair stuck in the chain and said, "Do you have any idea how long it took to grow that?" Mom had to physically shove him out of the way to get Ivy free. At the emergency room, the doctors had to shave part of Ivy's head to stitch her scalp back together. When we got home, Dad wouldn't even look at her. He made her wear a wig every single day until it grew back, and if the wig slipped even a little, he'd leave the room. Ivy started having nightmares and would wake up crying, and Dad told her she was being dramatic and that beauty required sacrifice. School was a nightmare with all that hair. I'd sit down in class and kids would step on it or it would get caught in my chair. One time in gym class, we were running laps, and I literally tripped over my own hair and face planted on the track. I started getting these headaches that made me want to throw up. The weight of my hair felt like someone was constantly pulling on my skull. At school, I'd fall asleep at my desk, and my teachers kept sending me to the nurse. Dad said I was being lazy and that plenty of women had long hair without complaining. Then things got really weird. I started feeling exhausted all the time, like completely drained even after sleeping for 12 hours. Some mornings I could barely lift my head off the pillow. My arms and legs felt so heavy. Mom kept saying I looked really pale, but Dad would interrupt and say I just needed vitamins. I'd wake up with bruises all over my body. One morning I was brushing my teeth and my gums just started bleeding everywhere. Mom wanted to take me to the doctor, but Dad said I was fine. One day I was walking to the cafeteria and everything went black. I woke up on the floor with the school nurse next to me and a bunch of kids staring. They called an ambulance, and at the hospital the doctors ran a ton of tests. Finally, this doctor came in and said, "Your daughter has leukemia and needs to start chemotherapy immediately, or she'll die. Her hair will need to go." I stared at my dad, who looked like he had his decision made. His face went completely blank, like someone had just turned off all the lights inside him. The doctor was still standing there with her clipboard, and Mom had her hands pressed against her mouth. I could see Dad's jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. He looked at me, and then at the doctor, and then back at me, and I knew he was doing the math in his head about whether my life was worth more than my hair. The silence stretched out so long that the clock on the wall got really loud. Mom made this tiny gasping sound, and Dad finally opened his mouth. He said we needed a second opinion because this doctor clearly didn't understand our family values. He said there had to be other treatment options that didn't require cutting my hair. Dr. Kemp's whole face changed from patient to something harder. She explained that every single minute we waited put me in more danger because my white blood cell count was already way too low. She said the leukemia was moving fast, and if we didn't start treatment immediately, I could die. Mom made that choking noise again and grabbed the edge of the exam table. I realized she might actually stand up to him for the first time ever. Dr. Kemp looked at both of them and said she needed to step out for a moment. She left and closed the door really carefully, like she was trying not to make any noise. Dad started pacing back and forth in the tiny space. Mom was crying without making any sound, and I just sat there on the exam table feeling the paper crinkle under me. About 10 minutes went by, and then Dr. Kemp came back with another woman. The new woman had short dark hair and was carrying a folder. She sat down in the chair across from us and said her name was Kaylee Lockwood from the hospital social services. She explained that when parents disagree about life-saving medical treatment, the hospital has ways to make sure the child stays safe. Dad's face went bright red and he started talking really fast about his rights as a parent. Kaylee just nodded and stayed completely calm. She asked if she could speak with me and Mom privately. Dad said no immediately. He said anything they needed to discuss could happen right in front of him. Kaylee nodded slowly, and then she picked up the phone on the wall. She spoke quietly to someone for maybe 30 seconds. 2 minutes later, a security guard showed up in the doorway. He was a big guy with a radio on his belt. Kaylee explained that she needed to complete a safety check and hospital policy let her ask for privacy. She told Dad he could wait in the family lounge or security would walk him out of the building. Dad looked like he wanted to explode, but the security guard just stood there blocking the door. Dad grabbed his jacket and stormed out. The security guard followed him at a distance. As soon as they were gone, Kaylee turned to Mom. She asked directly if Mom gave permission for the chemotherapy and the hair removal. Mom's hands were shaking. So bad she had to sit on them. She kept staring at the door like Dad might burst back through any second. I could see her trying to make her voice work. Finally, she whispered yes. She said yes, please save her daughter. Kaylee pulled out some official-looking forms and started writing. She explained that she was filing a report with Child Protective Services because a parent refusing life-saving medical treatment counted as medical neglect. Mom started crying harder and saying she wasn't refusing anything. She was saying yes right now. Kaylee's voice stayed gentle, and she said the report was about Dad's interference and the pattern of control she was already seeing. I felt this weird mix of relief and complete terror. Someone finally saw what was happening to us. But I also knew Dad was going to lose his mind when he found out. Dr. Kemp came back in and said they were admitting me right away to start chemotherapy tonight. She said my hair would need to be shaved in the next few days as the treatment kicked in. She wanted a nurse to do it in a controlled way instead of waiting for it to fall out in clumps. The way she talked about it so matter-of-fact made it feel slightly less scary. Like it was just another medical thing instead of destroying everything Dad had ever valued about me. They moved me to a room on the oncology floor. A nurse named Beth helped me change into a hospital gown. The gown was thin and had little blue diamonds on it. Mom sat in the chair by the window looking totally lost. She kept touching her own hair like she was checking to make sure it was still attached to her head. I wanted to say something to make her feel better, but I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. Beth was already setting up this tall metal pole with bags of clear liquid hanging from it. She said that was what would save my life. About an hour later, Dad showed up at my door with some guy in a suit. The guy was carrying a briefcase, and Dad was talking really loud about consent forms. They wanted to see the paperwork, and Dad's lawyer was threatening to sue the hospital. The security guard from before was back, and there was also a woman in business clothes who said she was a hospital administrator. She explained very calmly that Mom's consent was legally good enough. She said any attempt to mess with my treatment would result in a restraining order. Dad's lawyer looked uncomfortable and kept trying to get Dad to lower his voice. But Dad was ranting about parental rights and religious freedom even though we had never been religious ever. The administrator and security guard eventually got them to leave. Around 8 at night, the first chemotherapy started. I was expecting it to hurt immediately or make me throw up, but it just felt like cold liquid going into my arm through the IV. Dr. Kemp stopped by to check on me. She said side effects usually took a few hours to show up. She also said they had given me medicine to help with nausea. Then she mentioned that Kaylee had arranged for Mom to stay overnight on a cot in my room. That made me feel safer, but also guilty because I knew Mom was terrified about what Dad would do when she didn't come home tonight. I tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't let me. The hospital bed was too hard, and the IV in my arm kept pulling whenever I moved, and there were all these beeping sounds from machines I didn't understand. Around midnight, I woke up feeling like someone had poured concrete into my veins. Everything was so heavy I could barely lift my arm to touch my face. There was this gross metallic taste in my mouth like I'd been sucking on pennies, and it wouldn't go away no matter how much water I drank. Mom was still awake in the chair by the window, and her phone kept lighting up and buzzing. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. I asked what was happening, and she showed me the screen. Dad had sent like 30 texts in the past hour. The first few were asking when she was coming home. Then they got mean, saying she was betraying the family and abandoning her husband and choosing the hospital over him. The last one said if she didn't come home right now, he was going to come get her himself. Mom's hands were shaking while she held the phone. I told her to turn it off. Just turn it off and stop reading his messages. She stared at the screen for a long time, and I thought she was going to say no, that she had to keep it on in case Dad needed something. But then she pressed the power button and the screen went dark. She set the phone face down on the little table, and we both just sat there in the quiet, with only the beeping machines between us. The next morning, a nurse came in to check my blood pressure and temperature. Everything felt wrong with my body, like all my bones had turned to mush. The nurse said that was normal for chemo and that it would get worse before it got better. Mom was asleep finally, curled up on the cot with her hair spilling onto the floor. Around 9, Kaylee knocked on the door and came in with another woman. Kaylee introduced her as Violet and said she was from Child Protective Services and needed to ask me some questions. Violet was probably in her late 20s, way younger than I expected for someone who investigated families. She had short black hair cut in a pixie style that showed her whole face and neck. It felt like she was showing me on purpose what was possible. Like, look, you can have short hair and still be a whole person. She sat down in the chair next to my bed and pulled out a notebook and pen. She asked me to describe what a normal day was like at home. I started talking about the nightly hair brushing sessions that happened every single evening after dinner. Dad would make me sit on the floor between his knees while he brushed my hair for at least an hour, sometimes 2 if he found any tangles or split ends. He would inspect every single strand, and if he found damage, he'd want to know exactly what caused it. Did I brush it wrong that morning? Did I let it drag on the ground at the school? Was I not using enough conditioner? The questions would go on and on until I gave him an answer he accepted. Violet wrote everything down without saying much, and I kept talking because once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her about the wig punishment when I was 7, how Dad made me wear that huge heavy wig for 2 years because I cut 6 inches off my hair. I told her about Ivy's scalp injury on the swing set, and how Dad just stood there staring at the hair stuck in the chain instead of helping her while she screamed. I told her how Mom's hair was so long she had to carry it in her arms to walk, and how she couldn't drive because it would get caught in the car. The words just kept spilling out like someone had opened a drain in my brain. I described how tired I'd been for weeks, how I had bruises all over my body and my gums bled when I brushed my teeth. I told her Mom wanted to take me to the doctor, but Dad said I was fine, that I just needed vitamins and more sleep. Violet's pen moved across the paper the whole time, and her face stayed calm and professional. But I could see Mom in the corner, and she was crying without making any sound, just tears running down her face. Hearing everything laid out like this made it sound so much worse than it felt when we were living it. When I got to the part about the weeks of exhaustion and how Dad said I was being lazy, Violet's pen stopped moving for just a second. Then she kept writing. Dr. Kemp came in while I was still talking, and Violet introduced herself and explained why she was there. Dr. Kemp pulled up a chair and started talking directly to Violet about my cancer and the treatment plan. She said my leukemia was absolutely treatable if caught early, but it had progressed to a more dangerous level because of delayed diagnosis. She used the words medical neglect very deliberately, like she wanted to make sure Violet wrote them down exactly. Dr. Kemp explained that my symptoms were obvious, that any reasonable parent would have taken me to a doctor weeks ago when I started showing signs of serious illness. The exhaustion, the bruising, the bleeding gums, the fainting at the school. She said Dad's refusal to seek medical care because he was afraid a doctor would want to cut my hair met the legal definition of child endangerment. Mom made this small noise like she was choking and put her hand over her mouth. Violet asked Dr. Kemp specific questions about when my symptoms started and what would have happened if treatment had been delayed any longer. Dr. Kemp said very clearly that without immediate treatment, I would have died, probably within weeks. The room got really quiet after that. That afternoon, Kaylee came back and said the hospital's ethics committee was having an emergency meeting about my case. She explained they were reviewing whether additional legal steps were needed to protect me from Dad's interference with my treatment. Mom was invited to attend the meeting and she looked scared, but she went. I tried to sleep while she was gone, but I kept thinking about what Dr. Kemp said, about how I would have died if we'd waited any longer. It made me feel weird to know that Dad would have let me die rather than cut my hair. Like my hair mattered more to him than my actual life. Mom came back about 2 hours later and she looked exhausted, but also different somehow, like something had shifted in her face. She sat down on the edge of my bed and told me what happened. The committee agreed that my treatment should continue with her consent alone, and Dad didn't get a say anymore. They were supporting the CPS investigation into Dad's pattern of control and medical neglect. Mom's voice was shaking when she said it, but she also sounded slightly more sure of herself, like someone had finally told her she was allowed to protect her own kid. Later that afternoon, Kaylee spent a long time talking with Mom in the hallway right outside my room. The door was partially open and I could hear most of what they were saying. Kaylee was asking questions about finances and whether Mom had access to bank accounts or her own money. Mom's voice got really quiet and she admitted that Dad controlled everything. She didn't have her own credit card. Her name wasn't on the mortgage or the car titles. She hadn't worked in 15 years and didn't have any job skills. She didn't even know how much money was in their bank account because Dad handled all of that. Kaylee's response made it clear she'd heard this exact story before from other women. She started pulling out pamphlets about emergency housing and legal aid services and programs that help women leave abusive relationships. I heard her explaining something about safety planning and how there were resources available. Mom was crying again, but this time it sounded different, less hopeless somehow. I pretended to be asleep when they came back into the room, but I watched through barely open eyes as Kaylee left a stack of papers on the table next to Mom's cot. On day 3, Dr. Kemp came in during morning rounds and said it was time to shave my head. She explained that the chemotherapy was starting to affect my hair follicles, and it would be less traumatic to do it now in a controlled way, rather than wait for my hair to fall out in clumps over the next few weeks. My stomach dropped when she said it, even though I knew it was coming. I'd been preparing myself for this moment my entire life in a weird way. Like every time Dad brushed my hair and told me it was my only value, I was also imagining what it would be like to not have it anymore. I was scared, but I was also weirdly ready. Mom's face went white, and she asked if she could be there when it happened. I said yes immediately because I needed her to see me do this. I needed her to see that I could survive the thing Dad always said would destroy me, that I could lose my hair and still be a whole person. Dr. Kemp said she'd send a nurse in within the hour, and then she left. Mom and I just sat there looking at each other, and I could tell she was thinking about all the years of brushing and maintaining and protecting our hair like it was the most important thing in the world. The nurse who came in was the same one from the first night, Beth. She was carrying electric clippers and a plastic cape and a mirror. She explained exactly what she was going to do, how she'd use the clippers to buzz my hair down to almost nothing, and then we could decide if we wanted to shave it completely smooth or leave some stubble. She asked if I was ready, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. She put the cape around my shoulders and turned on the clippers, and the buzzing sound filled the whole room. I closed my eyes because I couldn't watch. I felt the vibration against my scalp starting at the front of my head and moving back. It felt like someone was erasing me. There was this sensation of lightness, like someone had just removed a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. Pieces of my hair fell onto the cape and I could feel them sliding down. The buzzing went on for a long time, moving over every part of my head in steady strokes. When Beth finally turned off the clippers, the room felt too quiet. She held up the mirror and I opened my eyes. I barely recognized the person looking back at me. My head looked so small and vulnerable, and I could see the shape of my skull, and my ears stuck out more than I realized. There were little bits of hair still clinging to my scalp like dark stubble. Mom was crying, but she came over and put her hands on my face and said I was beautiful. For the first time in my entire life, I thought she might actually mean it. Dad found out about my hair within hours somehow. Maybe the hospital called him, or maybe he just had a feeling. He showed up around 6 that evening, and I could hear him yelling before I could see him. Security stopped him at the elevator and wouldn't let him come to my floor, but his voice carried all the way down the hall. He was screaming that we'd destroyed something precious that could never be replaced. Those were his exact words. The same thing he said when I was 7 and cut 6 inches off with Mom's scissors. He was yelling about how we'd ruined everything and betrayed the family legacy, and how his mother and grandmother were probably rolling in their graves. I could hear the security guard trying to calm him down, and Dad just getting louder. Beth closed my room door and turned on the TV to drown out the noise, but I could still hear him. My whole body was shaking, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin. Mom sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face looked hard and set like she'd made a decision. The yelling went on for maybe 20 minutes before it finally stopped, and I figured security must have made him leave the building. That evening, Kaylee came back with a bunch of legal papers. She sat down with Mom and explained that Dad's behavior at the hospital proved he was a threat to my medical care and emotional well-being. She was filing for an emergency protective order that would prohibit Dad from visiting the hospital without supervision, and would give Mom sole authority to make all medical decisions until a full hearing could be scheduled. The order also requested that Dad be kept away from me entirely, except for supervised visits. Mom's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, but she signed every page where Kaylee pointed. I watched her sign her name over and over. This woman who had never stood up to Dad in 20 years of marriage. This was the first time she'd ever taken legal action against him. The first time she'd ever chosen us over him. When Kaylee left with the signed papers, Mom came and sat on my bed and we didn't say anything. We just sat there in the quiet hospital room with the TV playing some show neither of us were watching, and I reached up and touched my bald head and felt the strange new shape of myself. Around midnight, the nausea hit me like a truck, and suddenly I was leaning over the side of the bed, throwing up into the basin Mom grabbed from the bathroom. My whole body felt weak and shaky, and I couldn't stop heaving even when there was nothing left in my stomach. Mom held the basin steady with one hand and used the other to pull my hospital gown away from my face so I wouldn't get anything on it. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, like this was somehow her fault instead of just what chemo does to people. The throwing up went on for what felt like hours, and between waves of nausea, I'd collapse back on the pillow feeling like I weighed 1,000 pounds. Mom wiped my face with a cold washcloth and got me little sips of water when I could keep them down. But there was something different about the way she moved around the room, something stronger in how she held herself. It was like standing up to Dad and signing those legal papers had unlocked something in her that had been buried under all that hair and all those years of fear. She wasn't asking permission to take care of me anymore. She was just doing it. The next morning, Violet came back with a yellow legal pad full of questions, and this time she wanted to know about Ivy. Mom's face went pale when Violet asked if Ivy was safe at home alone with Dad, and Mom had to admit that yes, Ivy was still there because we didn't have time to make other arrangements before everything happened so fast. I could see the panic in Mom's eyes when Violet explained that CPS needed to do a welfare check right away, that afternoon if possible. I felt sick again, but this time it wasn't from the chemo. It was pure fear for my sister because I knew exactly how Dad would react when investigators showed up at the house asking questions. I begged Violet to make sure Ivy was okay, and Violet promised she would personally make sure the check happened today, and that someone would call us as soon as it was done. After Violet left, Mom just sat in the chair by the window staring at her phone like she could make it ring faster through sheer force of will. Around 4 that afternoon, Violet called and Mom put it on speaker, so I could hear too. Violet said Ivy was physically safe, no signs of injury or immediate danger, but she was clearly scared and Dad had been really controlling during the whole interview. He kept answering questions for Ivy and wouldn't let her speak freely, and when the investigator asked to talk to Ivy alone, Dad made this huge deal about his rights as a parent. The investigator had documented everything about the house, and Violet said it was pretty shocking evidence of the family's obsession with hair. There were photos of Dad's grandmother everywhere, like a shrine to this woman with floor-length hair. The bathroom had an entire cabinet just for hair products, $50 shampoos and special conditioners and treatments that cost more than groceries. But the worst part was this notebook the investigator found in Dad's desk, where he had tracked the growth of Mai and Ivy's hair like some kind of science experiment. He had measurements written down every month for years, notes about texture and thickness, even calculations about how long it would take to reach certain lengths. Violet said they scheduled a follow-up interview at Ivy's school, where Dad wouldn't be present so Ivy could talk freely, and she was adding all the documentation to the CPS file. The next day, this lawyer named Wallace showed up to meet with Mom, and he had kind eyes and a briefcase full of papers. Kaylee had connected us with him through some legal aid program that helps families in situations like ours. Wallace sat down and explained that he wanted to file for emergency custody of both me and Ivy, that the evidence of medical neglect combined with Dad's controlling behavior and Ivy's scalp injury from the swing set created a really strong case for temporary custody modification. He used words like petitioner and respondent and temporary orders, but what it basically meant was that Mom could get legal permission to keep us away from Dad while the court figured out what to do long term. Mom looked scared but also relieved, like she'd been waiting for someone in authority to tell her she was allowed to protect her own children. Wallace said he'd start the paperwork right away, and that we should have a court date within a few weeks. I ended up staying in the hospital for 8 days for that first round of chemo, and it was weird, but I actually started to feel kind of normal during that time. Not physically normal because I was tired and sick and bald, but normal in the way I got to just exist without Dad's constant presence hanging over everything. The nurses would come in and ask what I wanted to eat, and I could just say what I actually wanted instead of worrying about whether my choice would disappoint someone. Nobody timed how long I took in the bathroom or inspected what I was doing. I could sleep without worrying about someone coming in to check my hair or lecture me about taking care of something precious. Mom noticed the change too, and one afternoon she said she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen me look relaxed. That made me sad because it meant being in a hospital with cancer felt safer than being at home with my own father. On day 6, Ivy called Mom's phone from her friend's house, and I could hear her crying before Mom even put it on speaker. Ivy was begging to come stay at the hospital with us, and her voice sounded so small and scared. She said Dad had been even worse since I left, that he was brushing her hair for hours every single night, and talking about how she was the only daughter he had left who respected family values. He kept saying I had betrayed the family and that Ivy was his last hope for carrying on the tradition. Mom told Ivy to stay at her friend's house and that we were working on a plan to get her out, but I could hear Ivy crying harder and it broke my heart. I had escaped, but I left my little sister behind to deal with Dad alone, and now he was focusing all his crazy on her. After the call ended, Mom just sat there holding her phone and I saw her hands shaking. That same day, Mom's phone started buzzing with texts from numbers she didn't recognize, and when she opened them, we realized Dad was texting from different phones after she blocked his main number. The messages were getting scary, talking about how we'd destroyed the family and betrayed sacred traditions. He said Mom was manipulated by people who wanted to destroy families, and that she was going to regret choosing strangers over her husband. Then messages started coming from Dad's cousins and aunts, people Mom hadn't talked to in years, all saying basically the same thing about how Mom was wrong and Dad was right, and we were destroying something beautiful. Kaylee came by that evening to check on us, and when Mom showed her all the messages, Kaylee's face got really serious. She pulled out her laptop right there and started documenting every single message, taking screenshots and adding them to the CPS file as evidence of harassment. Then she helped Mom get a new phone number that only the hospital and the legal team would have access to. On day 9, I woke up feeling really hot and wrong, like my whole body was on fire from the inside. The nurse took my temperature and her face changed, and suddenly there were a bunch of people in my room checking my blood and hooking up new IV bags. Dr. Kemp came in and explained that my white blood cell count had dropped really low, something called neutropenia that happens sometimes with chemo. She said my body couldn't fight off infections right now, and that I needed to go to an isolation room where everyone would have to wear masks and gloves. They moved me to this room at the end of the hall that felt like being in a bubble, and suddenly I couldn't have any visitors except Mom. The fever made everything feel weird and disconnected, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. That night I had these horrible nightmares about my hair growing back and wrapping around my throat, choking me while Dad stood there brushing it and saying how beautiful it looked. I'd wake up gasping and reaching for my head to make sure it was still bald and safe. Mom refused to leave even when the nurses said she needed to rest and get some sleep. I woke up at 3 in the morning and she was sitting in the chair next to my bed just watching me breathe. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, and when she saw I was awake, she started talking about how she'd been thinking about all the years she spent maintaining her hair when she could have been protecting her daughters instead. She said she'd spent hours every day washing and conditioning and drying and brushing when she could have been working or saving money or building a life where we could leave. She started crying so hard she could barely talk, and I told her it wasn't her fault that Dad was the way he was, but she shook her head and said she chose to stay, and that made her responsible too. The fever finally broke after 36 hours, and I felt like a person again instead of a burning pile of nothing. While I was recovering and eating actual food for the first time in 2 days, Kaylee came in to talk to Mom about finances. She pulled up a chair and asked Mom directly about money and bank accounts, and Mom had to admit she had no access to anything. Dad controlled all the money. Mom didn't have her own credit card or checking account. Her name wasn't on the mortgage or the car titles or any of the bills. She hadn't worked in 15 years and didn't even know how she'd support herself and 2 kids if she actually left for real. Kaylee didn't look surprised at all, like she'd heard this exact story 100 times before. She pulled out these pamphlets about a domestic violence program that helps women establish financial independence, and she and Mom started working on what she called a safety plan. The plan included emergency housing and food assistance and job training resources, all these things I didn't even know existed. Kaylee wrote down phone numbers and websites and the names of people Mom could contact, and I watched my mother take notes like she was studying for the most important test of her life. Wallace filed the emergency custody petition with the family court the next morning, and the clerk stamped it with a hearing date 3 weeks out. The judge who reviewed the emergency motion granted a temporary order that same afternoon, giving Mom sole medical decision-making authority, and restricting Dad to supervised visits only at a location approved by CPS. The court papers got served to Dad at his work 2 days later, and according to the process server, he went completely white when he read them and had to sit down. That evening around 6 p.m., the security guard at the hospital called up to my floor to warn us that Dad was in the lobby demanding to see me and Mom. The guard said Dad was yelling about his rights and waving the court papers around, and when they told him he couldn't come up without supervision, he tried to push past the desk. 2 more security guards came down and they had to physically block him from getting to the elevators. Dad kept screaming that this was his hospital too, and that nobody could keep him from his daughter. The guards called the police when he wouldn't leave, and 2 officers showed up and escorted him out to the parking lot. One of the cops came up to my room afterward to take a report, and he said Dad was still sitting in his car in the parking lot just staring up at the building. The officer asked if we wanted to file for a restraining order, but Mom said the court order should be enough. Kaylee added the police report to the CPS file as more evidence of Dad's inability to respect boundaries. The whole thing made me feel sick because I could picture exactly how Dad looked, that expression he got when things didn't go his way, and he couldn't understand why everyone else didn't see things the way he did. 3 days after that, Mom's phone rang during lunch, and it was a nurse from Ivy's school. The nurse said Dad had shown up during the lunch period trying to take Ivy out of class, claiming there was a family emergency, and that Mom had sent him to pick her up. The school secretary asked for Mom's permission, and Dad got really aggressive, saying he was Ivy's father and didn't need permission from anyone. When they refused to release Ivy without talking to Mom first, Dad started yelling so loud that the principal had to come out of her office. He was going on about how the school was part of some conspiracy against him, and how they were keeping his daughter prisoner. The principal told him he needed to leave or she'd call the police, and Dad said go ahead and call them because he wasn't leaving without Ivy. So they did call the police, and when the officers arrived, Dad was still in the main office arguing with the secretary. The police made him leave the building and told him he wasn't allowed back on the school property. The nurse said Ivy was really shaken up because she'd heard Dad yelling from her classroom down the hall. Mom immediately called Violet and told her what happened, and Violet said she was filing an emergency removal order right then. She said this proved that Ivy wasn't safe with Dad having any access to her, supervised or not. That afternoon, a social worker showed up at Ivy's school during last period and pulled her out of class. The social worker explained that she was taking Ivy to the hospital to stay with Mom and me because it wasn't safe for her to go home. Ivy didn't even get to go back to the house to pack her stuff. The social worker said they'd arrange a supervised visit to get her clothes and schoolwork later. When Ivy walked into my hospital room around 4 p.m., she just stopped in the doorway and stared. I was sitting up in bed doing homework and I looked up and saw her face. She was staring at my bald head like she couldn't process what she was seeing. For a long moment, she didn't move or say anything, just stood there with her backpack still on and her floor-length hair pooling around her feet. Then her face just crumpled and she started crying, these big gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She dropped her backpack and ran over and threw her arms around me, and I hugged her back while she cried into my shoulder. When she finally pulled back and wiped her eyes, she looked at Mom and said she wanted to cut her hair too. She said she couldn't stand it anymore, that it was too heavy and too much work, and she didn't care what Dad thought about it. Her voice was shaking but also kind of fierce, like she'd been holding this in forever, and finally had permission to say it out loud. Mom's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds, and I could see her fighting between the old fear of Dad's reaction and this new determination to protect us. She took a deep breath and told Ivy that we were going to figure this out together, that nobody was going to force her to keep hair she didn't want anymore. The CPS social worker came back an hour later with paperwork placing Ivy in temporary protective custody with Mom as the custodial parent. This meant we were all staying at the hospital together until we could find safe housing away from Dad. The social worker said she'd arrange for someone to go to the house with police supervision to get Ivy's clothes and school stuff, and that Dad wouldn't be there when they did it. The hospital brought up a second cot and set it up in my room next to Mom's, and suddenly my hospital room felt like some kind of weird refuge camp. That night, after the nurses did their final rounds and turned off most of the lights, Ivy and I stayed up talking in whispers. We talked about everything Dad had put us through over the years, all the hours of hair brushing and inspection, the way he'd flip out over a single split end, how we'd both learned to move carefully so our hair wouldn't get caught on things. Ivy told me about the nightmares she still had about the swing set accident, how she'd wake up feeling the chain pulling at her scalp. I told her about the wig punishment when I was 7, and how I'd been too scared to ever try cutting my hair again until cancer made the choice for me. It was the first time we'd ever been able to talk freely about any of this without worrying Dad would overhear and punish us for being ungrateful. Mom was pretending to be asleep on her cot, but I could tell from her breathing that she was awake and listening to every word. The next morning, Ivy asked one of the nurses if someone could cut her hair. The nurse looked at Mom for permission and Mom nodded, her voice shaking a little when she said yes. The same nurse who'd shaved my head came in with scissors and a comb, and she had Ivy sit in the chair by the window. She asked Ivy how short she wanted to go, and Ivy said shoulder length, just get rid of all the weight. The nurse started with the scissors, cutting off huge sections of hair that fell to the floor in thick ropes. Ivy watched in the mirror the whole time with this expression I'd never seen on her face before, something between relief and disbelief. When the nurse finished and Ivy's hair was just touching her shoulders, Ivy reached up and ran her fingers through it. She could actually run her fingers through her hair without them getting stuck in tangles. She started laughing, this kind of shocked, happy laugh like she couldn't believe it was real. Mom was crying, but it wasn't the scared crying from before. It was this weird mix of happy tears and grief, like she was mourning all the years we'd lost while also celebrating that we were finally free. The nurse swept up all of Ivy's hair from the floor and asked if we wanted to keep any of it, and Ivy said no, without even hesitating. Dr. Kemp came by later that morning to check on me and said I was ready to be discharged. My blood counts were stable enough that I could go home as long as I came back every week for more chemotherapy sessions. But then she paused and looked at Mom and said, of course we couldn't actually go home because of the protective order. Mom's face fell because she hadn't thought that far ahead. Kaylee had mentioned that the temporary shelter the domestic violence program found only had space for 1 week, and after that we'd need somewhere else to stay. Dr. Kemp said she talked to the hospital social services about options for transitional housing. Kaylee came back that afternoon with information about a program that provides furnished apartments for families in crisis situations. She said there was a small 2-bedroom apartment available near the hospital that we could stay in for up to 3 months, while Mom looked for work, and we figured out permanent living arrangements. The apartment was part of a program specifically for domestic violence survivors, and the rent was covered by a grant, so we wouldn't have to pay anything for the first 3 months. Kaylee helped Mom fill out the application right there in my hospital room, and 2 days later we got the call that we were approved and could move in whenever we were ready. We moved into the apartment on a Saturday morning with just the bags of clothes that Kaylee had helped Mom pack during a supervised visit to the house while Dad was at work. A police officer had gone with them to make sure Dad didn't come home early, and Mom said it was the strangest feeling to walk through her own house like a stranger, grabbing only what we absolutely needed and leaving everything else behind. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, and it was tiny and kind of run down, with carpet that was worn thin in spots and kitchen cabinets that didn't close all the way. But it had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, and a lock on the door that Dad didn't have a key to. That first night, we didn't have much furniture yet besides what came with the apartment, so we ordered pizza and ate sitting on the living room floor. Ivy said this felt like the first real home we'd ever had, and I knew exactly what she meant. The house we'd grown up in had always felt like Dad's museum for his hair obsession, but this little apartment with its worn carpet and squeaky floors belonged to us. Mom got connected with a job training program through the domestic violence services, and she started going to classes 3 days a week to learn basic computer skills and office software. She was scared out of her mind because she hadn't worked since before I was born and didn't even know how to use Excel or email properly. But the program was designed for women in her exact situation, women who'd been out of the workforce for years because of controlling partners. They helped her put together a resume that emphasized her volunteer work and the accounting she'd done for Dad's business, and they had her practice interviewing until she could answer questions without her voice shaking. 2 weeks into the program, the instructor told her about a part-time job doing data entry for a medical billing company that let employees work from home. Mom applied and got hired within 3 days. The pay was only $12 an hour, but it was her own money in her own bank account that Dad couldn't touch. Kaylee gave me a journal with a blue cover and told me it might help to write things down. At first, I didn't know what to say, but then I started writing about everything, just letting it all pour out onto the pages. I wrote about the years of nightly hair brushing sessions and how Dad would inspect every inch for damage. I wrote about the wig punishment when I was 7 and how heavy it was, and how the other kids made fun of me. I wrote about Ivy's accident on the swing set and the blood and Dad's reaction. I wrote about feeling exhausted all the time and the bruises and how Dad said I was just being lazy. I wrote about the cancer diagnosis and shaving my head and this weird feeling of freedom that came with being bald. Some days I wrote angry entries about Dad and everything he'd stolen from us. Other days I wrote about being scared that the cancer would kill me anyway, and that all of this would be for nothing. Writing it all down made it feel more real somehow, like I was creating evidence that this actually happened and wasn't just some nightmare. Kaylee said both kinds of feelings were completely valid, and that I should keep writing whatever came into my head. Wallace came to the apartment one evening to prepare us for the custody hearing that was now 2 weeks away. He sat at our kitchen table with a folder full of papers and explained that Dad's lawyer was arguing that Mom had kidnapped us, and that the whole situation was a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by social workers who were too quick to interfere. Wallace said we had strong evidence on our side, including medical records, CPS reports, hospital documentation of Dad's interference with my treatment, the police reports from his attempts to violate the court order, and statements from my teachers and doctors. But he warned us that family court could be unpredictable, and that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that the judge might order some kind of visitation, even if Mom got custody. He said judges were sometimes reluctant to completely cut off a parent's rights, unless there was evidence of physical abuse, and what Dad did was mostly psychological control and medical neglect, which could be harder to prove. Mom's hands were shaking as she signed the papers Wallace needed, but her signature was steady and clear. The next morning, Kaylee called Mom's phone and her voice sounded different, like she was trying to stay professional, but also mad. She told Mom that Dad had started posting all over social media about us, claiming the hospital kidnapped his daughters and that Mom was brainwashed by people who hate families. Mom pulled up his page on her laptop and there were like 20 posts from the past 12 hours, each one with old photos of me and Ivy with our super long hair. The captions talked about how beautiful we used to be, and how the system destroyed us and took away our crowning glory. There were pictures I didn't even know he had, including one from when I was maybe 5 years old with my hair spread out on the grass like some kind of creepy photo shoot. People were commenting and sharing the posts, and some of Dad's relatives were writing things about how Mom betrayed the family and how we were being held against our will. Kaylee told us to screenshot everything, but not to respond or engage with any of it. She explained that this was actually good for our case because it showed the judge exactly what Dad cared about most. Every single post focused on our hair and our appearance. Not once did he mention my health or the cancer or whether I was okay. Kaylee added all the screenshots to the evidence file and said Dad was basically building our case for us by putting his obsession on public display for everyone to see. 3 days later, I went back to the hospital for my second chemotherapy session. This time I knew what to expect, so I wasn't as scared when they hooked up the IV. I'd packed snacks that were supposed to help with nausea, and I wore comfortable clothes and brought my journal to write in during the long hours of sitting there. The infusion took about 4 hours, and I felt the same weird coldness going into my veins and the metallic taste in my mouth. But I'd taken the anti-nausea medication before we even left the apartment, so when the sick feeling hit, it wasn't as bad as the first time. Dr. Kemp came by to check on me halfway through, and she looked at my chart and said my blood counts were improving. She explained that meant the cancer was responding to treatment and shrinking, which was exactly what we wanted to see. I asked her how long I'd have to keep doing this, and she said probably 6 months of treatment total, maybe longer depending on how my body responded. She reminded me there would be setbacks and bad days, but so far everything was going according to plan. After she left, I sat there watching the clear liquid drip into my arm and felt this strange mix of grateful and angry. Grateful that the chemo was working and killing the cancer cells, but angry that I had to be here at all because Dad waited so long to get me help. Mom squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing. A few days after that, Beth, who ran the teen cancer support group at the hospital, stopped by during one of my checkups. She was maybe 30 years old with short hair that was growing back in after her own cancer treatment, and she had this really calm way of talking that made you feel less alone. She invited me to come to the support group that met every Thursday evening in one of the conference rooms. I told her I didn't know if I wanted to sit around talking about cancer with a bunch of other sick kids, but she said I should just try it once and see. That Thursday, Mom drove me to the hospital and I walked into the conference room feeling super nervous. There were about 8 other teenagers sitting in a circle, some with no hair like me and some wearing hats or scarves. Beth started the meeting by asking if anyone wanted to share what was going on with their treatment. This girl named Mia, who looked about 16, raised her hand and talked about how she'd been in treatment for 2 years and was finally in remission. Then she said something that made me sit up straighter. She talked about how getting cancer actually freed her from her parents' expectations about who she was supposed to be. Before cancer, her parents had her whole life planned out with ballet and piano and straight A's and the perfect college. But when she got sick, all of that fell away, and she realized she didn't want any of it. She said cancer gave her permission to figure out who she actually was, instead of who everyone else wanted her to be. Her story was totally different from mine, but also exactly the same. She talked about control and expectations and finally getting to make her own choices. After the meeting ended, I went up to Mia and we talked for like 20 minutes about what it felt like to have your body become a battleground for other people's issues. She gave me her number and said to text her anytime I needed to talk to someone who understood. That same week, Ivy started seeing a therapist named Dr. Branson, who worked with kids from controlling families. Mom found her through the domestic violence program, and Dr. Branson had evening appointments so Ivy could go after school. The first few sessions, Ivy came home quiet and wouldn't really talk about it. But then one night at dinner, she said Dr. Branson told her that what Dad did with the hair control met the definition of psychological abuse. She said Dr. Branson explained that the scalp injury from the swing set should have resulted in a CPS investigation years ago, and that teachers and doctors were supposed to report that kind of thing. Ivy looked relieved when she talked about it, like someone finally confirmed that our family wasn't normal, and she wasn't crazy for thinking it was wrong. Around the same time, Mom started going to a support group for survivors of domestic abuse. She went every Tuesday night and would come back looking exhausted but also somehow lighter. She told us the group helped her see patterns she didn't recognize before, like how Dad isolated her from friends and family, and controlled all the money, and made her feel like she couldn't survive without him. Watching both of them start to heal made me realize how sick our whole family system was. It wasn't just me with cancer. We were all sick in different ways, and we were all learning how to get better. 10 days before the custody hearing, Wallace called to tell us that Dad's lawyer had sent a message. Dad wanted to meet with us to apologize before the court date. Wallace said it over speakerphone so we could all hear, and his voice was really serious when he told us he strongly advised against it. He explained that this was probably a manipulation tactic to make Dad look good for the judge. Like he could say he tried to reconcile and we refused. Mom asked what would happen if we said no, and Wallace said the judge wouldn't hold it against us, that we had every right to maintain boundaries. I felt this weird curiosity about what Dad would even say, whether he was capable of understanding what he did wrong, or if he'd just try to convince us to come home. But Mom made the decision for all of us. She told Wallace to decline the request and said we weren't ready for that, and might never be ready. Wallace said that was completely reasonable and he'd respond to Dad's lawyer right away. After the call ended, Ivy looked relieved, and Mom looked determined, and I realized that Mom was finally learning to protect us instead of protecting Dad's feelings. Wallace came over to the apartment 2 days later with a folder full of papers. He said the judge might want to hear from me directly at the hearing, so we needed to prepare a statement just in case. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me to describe what I wanted the judge to know. I started talking about the nightly hair brushing sessions that lasted hours, about the wig punishment when I was 7, about Ivy's scalp injury and Dad's reaction, about feeling exhausted and sick for weeks while Dad said I was just being lazy. Wallace typed everything I said into his laptop and then printed it out for me to practice reading. The first time I tried to read it out loud, I started crying before I even got through the first paragraph. Wallace said showing emotion was okay, and that the judge needed to see how this affected me, but I also needed to be able to get through the whole thing. We practiced for over an hour with Mom sitting next to me holding my hand. Wallace recorded me on Mom's phone so I could watch myself and get more comfortable with the words. By the end, I could read the whole statement without completely breaking down, though my voice still shook on the parts about Dad refusing to take me to the doctor. Wallace said I was doing great, and that my testimony could make a real difference in the judge's decision. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. When I finally did fall asleep, I had this nightmare that I was back home in my old bedroom. Dad was sitting on the edge of my bed, brushing my hair like he used to, except in the dream my hair was growing back super fast. Long strands were sprouting from my head and wrapping around my neck and arms like chains. The more Dad brushed, the longer it grew, and I couldn't breathe because it was choking me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, and Dad just kept brushing and smiling like everything was normal. I woke up gasping and my hands flew to my head, feeling the smooth skin and the short stubble that was starting to grow back. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought I might be sick. Mom must have heard me because she came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. We didn't turn on the light, just sat there in the dark together. She asked if I was okay, and I told her about the dream. She was quiet for a minute, and then she said tomorrow would change everything one way or another. She said no matter what the judge decided, we weren't going back to living like that. We sat there for a long time talking about what might happen at the hearing and what we'd do afterward. Eventually, I fell back asleep with Mom still sitting there, and this time I didn't dream at all. The custody hearing started at 9 in the morning in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and something I couldn't quite name. Maybe fear, or maybe just years of people's problems soaking into the walls. Dad was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table with his lawyer. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked like a completely normal, respectable father who'd been wronged by the system. He didn't look at us when we walked in, and I didn't look at him either. The judge was a woman probably in her 50s with gray hair and glasses. She looked tired, like she'd seen 1,000 cases just like ours. She sat down at the big desk at the front and explained that this hearing would determine temporary custody and medical decision-making, while the CPS investigation continued. She said both sides would present evidence and testimony, and then she'd make a ruling based on what was in the best interest of the children. Wallace stood up first to present our side. He laid out the timeline of events, starting with my cancer diagnosis, and Dad's interference with treatment. I watched the judge's face carefully to see if anything he said made her react, but her expression stayed completely neutral. Violet was the first person to testify. She walked to the front and swore to tell the truth with her hand on a Bible. Then she sat down in the witness chair, and Wallace started asking her questions. She described her investigation and what she found when she visited our house. She talked about the photos of Dad's grandmother covering the walls, the cabinets full of expensive hair products, the notebook where Dad tracked our hair growth like some kind of science experiment. She presented printed photos of the house as evidence, and the judge looked at each one carefully. Wallace asked about the documented history of control, and Violet explained the wig punishment from when I was 7, and Ivy's scalp injury from the swing set. She read directly from her report about how Dad stood there asking about the hair while Ivy was bleeding and screaming. The judge asked if Dad was ever physically violent, and Violet said no. The abuse was psychological and medical rather than physical. But she emphasized that psychological abuse could be just as damaging as physical abuse, sometimes even more so because it was harder to see and harder to prove. Dr. DeKemp testified next through a video call on a big screen at the front of the courtroom. She explained my cancer diagnosis and the type of leukemia I had. She described the symptoms I'd been showing for weeks, the exhaustion and bruising and bleeding gums that any reasonable parent should have recognized as signs of serious illness. She stated clearly that Dad's refusal to seek medical care when I was obviously sick constituted medical neglect. Then she talked about the progression of my cancer during those weeks of delay, how it went from early stage to more advanced because of the lack of treatment. She explained Dad's attempts to prevent me from receiving chemotherapy, and how he focused on my hair instead of my survival. The judge asked if my prognosis was good now that treatment had started. Dr. Kemp said yes, but emphasized that any further delays or interruptions could be catastrophic. She said I needed consistent treatment for at least 6 months, and that my mother had been fully cooperative with the medical team, while my father had been actively obstructive. The judge took notes during the whole testimony, and I could see her writing faster during certain parts, especially when Dr. Kemp talked about how the delay could have killed me. Wallace stood up and called Mom to the witness chair. She walked to the front with her hands shaking and sat down after putting her hand on the Bible. Wallace started asking her questions about the marriage, and Mom's voice came out quiet at first, but got stronger as she talked. She described how Dad controlled what she wore, and how she styled her hair, and who she could see. She explained that over 20 years he slowly cut her off from her friends and family until she had nobody except him. She talked about the nightly hair brushing that could go on for 3 or 4 hours while Dad inspected every inch for damage. She described how he would make her stand in front of him while he checked for split ends, and how he'd get angry if he found even one. Mom explained that she had no access to bank accounts and no credit cards in her name, and that Dad controlled every dollar that came into the house. Her voice shook when she talked about being too scared and too broke to leave, but she didn't cry. She looked right at the judge and said she should have protected us sooner, but she's protecting us now, and she'll never let Dad control us again. The judge wrote notes the whole time and asked a few questions about specific incidents. When Wallace finished, Mom walked back to sit with us, and her whole body was trembling. Dad's lawyer stood up next and started presenting their defense. He argued that Dad came from a culture where long hair on women was deeply valued, and that his beliefs were protected under religious freedom. Dad took the stand and testified that he never meant to hurt anyone. He said he was just trying to preserve family traditions that had been passed down through generations. He talked about his grandmother and mother and how hair was sacred in his family. He claimed the cancer diagnosis was a shock, and that he only hesitated about treatment because he needed time to process such a big change. His lawyer showed photos of Dad's mother and grandmother with hair down to their ankles, trying to make it look like cultural heritage instead of abusive control. Dad kept using words like tradition and values and sacred, and his lawyer nodded along like this was all perfectly reasonable. I watched the judge's face to see if she was buying any of it, but her expression stayed neutral. The judge asked Dad directly why he didn't take me to a doctor when I was showing symptoms of serious illness. Dad stumbled over his answer and said he thought I was just tired from the school. He said Mom was overreacting and that teenagers are always exhausted. The judge pointed out that multiple people, including teachers, noticed I was sick. She asked if his concern about my hair influenced his decision not to seek medical care. There was a long pause where Dad just sat there looking at his lawyer. Finally, he admitted that he was worried a doctor might want to cut it. The courtroom went completely quiet. Even Dad's lawyer looked uncomfortable. The judge wrote something down and her pen moved fast across the paper. Wallace stood up again and said the judge didn't need to question me directly, which made relief flood through my whole body because I didn't think I could face Dad in person. Wallace presented my written statement instead. He read parts of it out loud, describing the wig punishment when I was 7 and the daily hair inspections and how Dad made us spend hours on hair care. He added the medical records showing how my cancer got worse during the weeks Dad refused to take me to a doctor. The judge took the papers and read through everything carefully. I watched her face and saw her expression get harder when she reached the part about the wig punishment. She flipped through the medical records and compared them to the timeline in my statement. After both sides finished presenting evidence, the judge said she needed 30 minutes to review everything. We went to a small room down the hall to wait. Mom held my hand so tight it almost hurt, but I didn't pull away. Ivy was with us and she kept asking if we were going to have to go back home with Dad. Wallace tried to prepare us for different possible outcomes. He explained that the judge might order shared custody or supervised visits or full custody to Mom. He said we had a strong case, but that family court could be unpredictable. I could tell from his face that he thought we'd win, but he didn't want to promise anything. The 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. Mom's leg bounced up and down the whole time and Ivy chewed on her thumbnail until it bled. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge had papers spread out in front of her. She looked at Mom and then at Dad and started reading her ruling. She granted Mom temporary sole legal custody of both me and Ivy. She gave Mom sole medical decision-making authority. Dad was allowed supervised visitation once per week for 2 hours, supervised by a professional monitor that he had to pay for. The judge also ordered Dad to attend therapy focusing on control and parenting issues. She said the current arrangement would stay in place for at least 6 months, while Dad demonstrated he could respect boundaries and put his children's well-being over his personal beliefs. I felt Mom's hand squeeze mine even tighter, and I heard her make this small sound like she was trying not to cry. Dad's face went completely white. For a second, I thought he might jump up and start yelling right there in the courtroom. His lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something in his ear. Dad just sat there looking like someone had died. The judge added that any attempt to contact us outside of supervised visitation, or any violation of the court order, would result in suspension of all visitation rights. She looked directly at Dad when she said this, and her expression made it clear she wasn't making an idle threat. Dad's lawyer nodded and said they understood. Dad didn't say anything at all. We left the courthouse through a side exit to avoid running into Dad. Wallace walked with us to Mom's car in the parking garage. He explained that this was a really good outcome. He said sole custody and supervised visitation meant we were protected while still technically preserving Dad's parental rights. Mom started crying with relief and had to lean against the car. Ivy and I were both kind of numb with the realization that we actually won. A judge believed us and chose our safety over Dad's feelings. Wallace gave Mom his card and told her to call if Dad tried to contact us or violate the order in any way. He said to document everything just in case we needed it for the permanent custody hearing in 6 months. That evening, back at the apartment, Mom made spaghetti for dinner while Ivy and I did homework at the small kitchen table. It was such a normal scene, but it felt revolutionary because nobody was timing us or inspecting us or controlling what we did. We could just exist without someone watching our every move. Mom's phone rang and the screen showed Dad's number. She stared at it for a second and then declined the call. She opened her messages and forwarded the call log to Wallace like he'd told her to do. A few minutes later, Dad called again, and Mom declined it again, and sent another screenshot to Wallace. Learning to maintain boundaries was harder than I expected. Part of me still felt guilty for not answering even though I knew we didn't have to. We were all practicing together, figuring out what normal looked like. 2 weeks after the hearing, Mom came home from work with this huge smile on her face. She'd been offered a full-time position with benefits at the medical billing company. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover rent on a small apartment and basic expenses, especially with the child support the court ordered Dad to pay. That weekend, we started looking at 2-bedroom apartments in a neighborhood near my hospital and Ivy's new school. We went to 3 different showings, and Mom asked us what we thought about each one. For the first time in my life, I got to have opinions about where we lived and what our home looked like. Ivy wanted a place with a balcony, and I wanted to be close to the bus line for my hospital appointments. Mom wrote down everything we said and promised we'd find something that worked for all of us. We found a place the following week and signed the lease with Mom's new paychecks and the first child support payment that came through. My 4th chemotherapy session happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and I walked into the oncology ward feeling less scared than the first 3 times. The nurses knew me now, and one of them got my IV started while I settled into the familiar infusion chair by the window. Dr. Kemp came in with my chart and sat down across from me with this small smile on her face. She said my cancer was responding even better than expected, that my blood counts were improving steadily, and the scans showed the tumors shrinking. She reminded me I still had months of treatment ahead and would need regular monitoring for years, but the prognosis was genuinely good. When I left the hospital that day, I caught my reflection in the big glass window by the main entrance and barely recognized myself. My head was completely bald with just a little bit of stubble starting to grow back, and my face looked thinner with these dark circles under my eyes that made me look older. But somehow I looked more real than I ever did with all that hair, like I could finally see the actual shape of my face and who I was underneath everything Dad had built on top of me. Mom picked me up in the used car she'd bought with her first full paycheck, and we drove back to our new apartment in silence, both of us processing what good news actually felt like after so many years of just surviving. The apartment was small, and the furniture was mostly secondhand stuff from donation centers, but it was ours, and nobody was going to show up and inspect us or control what we did with our own bodies. One Saturday morning, about 2 weeks after we moved in, I woke up to the sound of the bathroom door closing, and then this weird cutting noise like scissors going through something thick. I got out of bed and walked to the bathroom door just as Mom came out holding a huge pile of hair in her arms. Her hair was cut to shoulder length and she looked absolutely terrified but also lighter somehow, like she'd just put down something heavy she'd been carrying for 20 years. She stood there shaking and said she couldn't carry that weight anymore, literally or metaphorically. That watching me go through chemo and Ivy cut her hair had made her realize she was still letting Dad control her even though he wasn't here. Her hair had been past her knees since before I was born, and watching it fall to the bathroom floor felt like watching chains break and scatter. Ivy and I grabbed scissors and helped her even it out because Mom's hands were shaking too badly to do it herself. And we all ended up crying. But it was the good kind of crying that means something is finally over. We swept up the hair and put it in a garbage bag, and Mom carried it out to the dumpster like she was throwing away evidence of a crime. 3 months after the custody hearing, we were settling into our new normal, and it still felt weird, but also right in a way nothing ever had before. I had chemotherapy every other week, and I was back in the school part-time with homebound instruction for the days I felt too sick to go in. Ivy was thriving with her short bob haircut and weekly therapy sessions, making friends who never knew the girl with floor-length hair who couldn't run at recess or play sports. Mom was working full-time at the medical billing company and taking online classes at night to finish the college degree she'd abandoned when she married Dad at 19. We still had supervised visits with Dad every Wednesday evening at a family services office, and he mostly just sat there in silence while the monitor took notes on her clipboard. He wasn't trying to control us anymore because the court order made it clear he'd lose all access if he tried, but he also wasn't really trying to connect or understand what he'd done wrong. I kept a photo on my phone from last week where the three of us were standing in front of our apartment building. Mom had shoulder-length hair that moved in the wind. Ivy had her cute bob, and I had my bald head with stubble growing back in, and I was smiling bigger than I'd ever smiled in any photo Dad had taken. We weren't perfect, and we definitely weren't healed because you don't heal from 14 years of control in just 3 months, but we were safe, and we were free, and we were finally living like our bodies belonged to us, instead of to someone else's idea of what we should be. That was enough for now. That's the story for today. I'm really happy you took a few minutes to share it with me. It makes these moments feel more special. Hopefully it left you feeling a little lighter. Subscribe if you'd like to come back for more.